What's up, Chromatic Yogis? This month we are going to be focusing on the pelvis and its movements. So we have four movements of the pelvis. We have anterior tilt, posterior tilt, lateral tilt, and then we have pelvic rotation. And we're going to go over each of these and what postures each of us would do based on if we had a class focused on one of these elements.
So our first week of December, we're working toward anterior tilt of the pelvis. And that is usually one of the more familiar actions that their pelvis takes if you've ever done a cow pose before. It's when the front of your pelvis tips forward and your tailbone tips up.
For week two, we're looking at the opposite, posterior tilt of the pelvis. Think tucking the tailbone. What we find in that rounded cat spine as the opposite of what Heidi was just cueing in your typical cat-cow. And the front points of the pelvis on the front side of the body tip towards the back side of the body. That's why it's called posterior tilt.
And then in week three, we are doing lateral tilt of the pelvis. So this would be if you were standing on uneven ground, where one foot was standing on something higher than the other, and your pelvis did a little little tilt there. That would be lateral tilt of the pelvis.
So week four is pelvic rotation, and this is a difficult one. Most of us think about rotation of the hip, and that's when the thigh bone rotates internally or externally, and those are easy to think about. But pelvic rotation is when the foot is fixed on the ground, so the thigh really can't move, but the pelvis can still rotate around the thigh. And this happens, let's say if you're in tree pose, your pelvis will naturally rotate around the standing leg out towards the bent knee. So this is pelvic rotation. You could, of course, balance that out by rotating the pelvis back to center, and that would be internal pelvic rotation.
Well, for anterior tilt for the first week, personally, when I'm in like a pyramid pose or even a halfway lift, where if you're tight in the back of your body, you're sort of naturally pulled into a posterior tilt. So trying to, against that tucking of the tailbone down, I like to try and pull my tailbone up into an anterior tilt. And sometimes you have to soften the knees if you're really tight like I am. But it's a really cool understanding of how you can impact lengthening at either end of the spectrum. And it's something that we don't naturally tend to have access into. So it's fun to play with it.
It's great. If you have tight hamstrings in a pyramid pose, then that can be really beneficial. If you're a flexible yogi, that's something to just look out for, because you can overly stretch the hamstrings from that position.
For posterior tilt, trying to teach the students how to both find the joint alignment of the posterior tilt in a passive position versus in a more active position. I probably like to bring them forward first through the cat-cow positions like we talked about a second ago, but then more into like a loaded position, like a plank pose, and just really focus on that, like drawing the belly button in up towards the spine, curling the tailbone, lengthening the tailbone towards the heels, whatever the language is that you like, so you feel more of the hollow body shape in the plank. From there you can go a bunch of different places.
There's something that I think folks should really understand is that posterior tilt can come from the front side of the body, anterior side, which is the core muscles, or it could come from the posterior side, the back side, the buttock muscles. In chromatic yoga, we have the option. You can do just focus on posterior tilt, the action, or if you want to focus on a muscle group, one day you can focus on the glute muscles, the buttock muscles, and hamstrings as well. Another day you can focus on the core muscles, and they're both going to create the same action, but from different sides of the body.
Posterior tilt is also a great way to counteract what Heidi was saying in pyramid pose for any super stretchy yogis who don't want to overstretch their hamstrings. You can do posterior tilt, a little tuck of the tailbone and tuck of the pelvis.
You can bring in the aspect of swadhyaya of self-study. So like understand your body. These are the two actions, week 1 and 2, essentially together. Try it this way. Now try it the opposite way. And so you can take the same pose from either direction.
The whole purpose of like having a physical through line in chromatic yoga is so that people could better understand what's appropriate for them. You can then assess what is appropriate for me based on my needs at this time in my life. So posterior tilt really requires that the lumbar spine is in flexion and the hips are in extension. That would be posterior tilted pelvis. And in a back bend, lumbar is an extension, and people use posterior tilt to minimize the extension of the lumbar spine. So If you wanted to reduce how much of the back bend is going into the low back, you would posterior tilt. Or another reason you would posterior tilt is if you were trying to get your buttock muscles more active.
Awake.
Yeah. So if you were struggling like, oh, I can't quite get my hips lifted, you could try digging down through your heels, which is what I would say, to try to activate the gluteus muscles. And I would use that as a peak engagement versus an action. But if someone was struggling and couldn't access their buttock muscles, regardless of the cues, then you can actually tell them to go into posterior tilt, and that would likely help them find their buttock muscles. Side note of that, though, is if they posterior tilt from the abdominal muscles, it then actually makes it harder to lift the pelvis. So it's confusing to the student, but it's also confusing to anyone analyzing it why it might be difficult to get the pelvis lifted. Ultimately, the easiest way to get the hips higher would be to relax the abdominal muscles and contract the gluteus muscles, which is half of a posterior tilt, right? So that's why there's a lot of debate about which to do when going up. And that's why some people experience it one way and others experience it the other way. But that's the point of chromatic yoga, is to help each of us understand with clarity what these joint actions and or muscle articulations or muscle engagements create for us in our practice so we can make better decisions.
I know my practice really evolved when I started putting the connection between anterior tilt and an internal spiral of the thigh bone versus posterior tilt and an external rotation of the thigh bone.
So in lateral tilt, lateral tilt can be created from either side. So it could be created from the abductors of, let's say, the bottom down the bottom hip, and then the top hip, for lack of a better way to explain that, could be created from the oblique muscles or QL in the lower back. So that opens up a lot of different options for peak poses, for sequences, and different ways to get into it. The two peak poses that come to mind right away for me are Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana B, to get a lateral tilt of the pelvis, and then also a similar pose, just changed relationship to gravity, would be extended side plank, creating lateral tilt of the pelvis to be able to extend a little bit more deeply.
Yeah. Okay, so for week one with an anterior tilt of the pelvis, maybe it's a halfway lift or a forward fold. You could also do it with two legs apart for like a pyramid, but for sake of being succinct, let's stick with a halfway lift where both legs are together. If you have tight hamstrings, then trying to use your back muscles to bring you into an anterior tilt, which will increase the sense of like, ooh, that's a lot of length that I'm getting in the back of my legs. That's a fun thing to play with, anterior tilt that way. If you're very flexible and have a lot of movement in your hamstrings, when that might not be the best thing for you, then even though you're still in a straight legged posture, being able to find a little bit of posterior tilt of your pelvis will take out some of that intense lengthening and create a little bit of a different sensation, which leads you perfectly into our second week.
Yeah, awesome. And just to add to that, you've got postures like seated forward fold, which anterior tilt can really help a lot.
Any seated
posture is going to really be benefit from anterior tilt if you were trying to increase the flexibility of the hamstrings.
You're in a seated forward fold and you're trying to find an anterior tilt, sitting up on a block or on a blanket to be able to decrease some of that tightness in the hamstrings, to be able to find that anterior tilt will be a really useful tool for you as well.
So for posterior tilt, we really have an opportunity to help our students understand how to access the joint alignment from both the front side of the body or the back side of the body. If you want to do more of a front side of the body focus, we're looking at how to engage the abdominals to come into posterior tilt. You might bring your students into a plank pose with an emphasis on like hollow body, really flexing through the spine, curling the tailbone towards the heels. You could take that all the way up into your handstand, any of your arm balances. That kind of engagement and facility over that area of your body, the pelvis, in arm balances is invaluable, as you'll learn if you're practicing arm balances over time. If you're trying to bring the students into posterior tilt from the back side of the body, go to a bridge pose, feel how they can use their glutes to lift the hips up and then lengthen that tailbone towards the backs of the knees. That could evolve into something like reverse plank, or yeah, other postures like that.
With anterior tilt, where the hamstrings are stretching, if you want to do what we call a balancing action, the opposite muscle contraction of the joint alignment, you can put posterior tilt there. So for example, if you were doing, let's say, a straight leg forward fold pyramid pose, if you want to resist some of that flexibility that happens when you forward fold in the hamstrings, perhaps you have perhaps you have more flexible hamstrings and you want to protect them, or perhaps you have hamstring tendonitis and you want to avoid that, you could posterior tilt the pelvis. Of course, that would put more of a stretch now into the back muscles versus the hamstrings, which may or may not be a good thing. It depends upon what you're going for in your body.
And then in week 3, we are doing lateral tilt of the pelvis.
Lateral tilt could be created from either side. So it could be created from the abductors, could be created from the oblique muscles or QL in the lower back, Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana B, to get a lateral tilt of the pelvis. A similar pose, just changed relationship to gravity, would be extended side plank.
Week 4 is all about pelvic rotation, and pelvic rotation is confusing. It happens at the hip joint, but we think about pelvic rotation when the pelvis is revolving around the thigh bone versus the thigh bone revolving around the pelvis. So what does that mean? Normally you would think about rotation at the hip where the thigh is moving and the pelvis is stable. But what happens if your thigh is fixed, meaning you have one foot on the ground, you can't really move that thigh, let's say in tree pose, but you can move the pelvis around the thigh bone, and that's what we refer to as pelvic rotation. So if you were in tree pose and you take one foot, let's say your left foot up to your right inner thigh, typically the pelvis will naturally rotate because of the weight of that leg to the left. That would be right leg standing, pelvis rotates to the left. That would be external rotation according to the hip joint. So pelvis is rotating outward. Now, if you wanted a peak action, for example, of internal rotation of the pelvis or hip, you would turn the pelvis back to center. And it's just helpful to think about pelvis rotating versus the hip rotating because that's the actual area that is moving for the student, the practitioner that is in the body, right? Even in Warrior 3, your pelvis will start to rotate a little bit externally away from the standing leg, and you can work to turn it back to center. I think everything we're trying to do within chromatic yoga is to improve the functionality and remove unintentional habitual behaviors in the physical body, especially, right? So, I mean, of course, in chromatic yoga, habitual behaviors overall, but when we're talking about physical through line, to try to help us become aware of our habitual behaviors and then make changes to be deliberate about our actions so that we can cultivate new patterns that support our physical body's overall health and well-being. And so assessing things like when you stand on your feet, do you shift into one hip versus the other hip? That is, in essence, a lateral tilt. And there's going to be some pelvic rotation that occurs there, probably some anterior or posterior tilt as well. And these are just things that, if we emphasize the learning process of each of these actions, we get faster at assessing those patterns in our own body.
Yeah, and I'll add that this month will be really interesting because I think a lot of us as teachers might think about the limbs or maybe the core or the back or something that everywhere but the pelvis. And when you really focus on isolating your own thought pattern and your own creativity on engaging muscles to manipulate the pelvis, I find that it cracks open a whole new world of looking at postures and looking at sequences, and maybe even enables me to find some different drills and movements that I hadn't really even thought of before.
For all the chromatic yoga teachers out there, always remember you have the opportunity to explore joint action, which is the articulation, versus the muscle engagement, what we call peak engagements. You don't have to even teach the actual joint action as long as you're teaching the muscle engagement, which just might simply be an isometric contraction of the muscles that create posterior, anterior, lateral, or rotation of the pelvis. The purpose is to help us get more in tune with what muscles create these actions, and then of course to improve our functionality to be able to move in these ways. But stabilizing and preventing movement is part of that equation. So as long as you're focused in on either a joint action or muscle contraction, then that has to do with the umbrella of the topic that you're focusing on, then you're in the right zone.